In 2026, for the first time in its entire history, a team is going to walk out onto a World Cup pitch wearing the colors of Uzbekistan. The tournament is being played across 3 countries on the edges of 2 oceans. And the team stepping onto that field comes from the single most sea-locked nation in the entire World Cup. A country so cut off from the ocean that to reach salt water, you have to leave it, cross an entire foreign country, and then cross another one. And honestly, that's just the first thing about Uzbekistan that makes no sense. Because the closer you look at this place, the stranger it gets. This is a desert country that used to have a sea, and then lost it. A country whose mighty rivers flow with the power of giants and never reach an ocean. A country that is, by one measure, the most isolated nation on the map. And that was once, quite literally, the center of the entire world. But let's take these one at a time, because none of them should be true at the same time. Start with the geography, because it's almost a riddle. You know what landlocked means, a country with no coastline. There are 44 of them, but Uzbekistan belongs to a club with exactly one other member on the entire planet. It is doubly landlocked. Here's what that means. It's not just that Uzbekistan has no coast. It's that every single country touching Uzbekistan also has no coast. Look at its neighbors. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, every one of them landlocked too. So to get from Uzbekistan to any ocean on Earth, you can't just cross one border. You have to cross at least 2. You have to pass through one landlocked country and then through another before you ever smell the sea. On the whole planet, only 2 countries are trapped this deeply: Uzbekistan and the tiny European principality of Liechtenstein. But Liechtenstein has about 40,000 people and will never come close to a World Cup. Uzbekistan has more than 35 million, which makes the team walking out in 2026 the first doubly landlocked nation in the history of the sport to ever reach a World Cup. And here's the twist that makes it stranger still. Uzbekistan wasn't always this cut off. For most of the last century, it was part of the Soviet Union, a country with one of the longest coastlines on Earth. Back then, an Uzbek could travel to the ocean without ever leaving home. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And when it shattered into 15 separate nations, the new borders snapped shut around Uzbekistan like a trap. The country didn't move an inch. The sea just walked away from it. But a country being far from the sea, that's unusual, not impossible. Here's the part that genuinely shouldn't be possible. This landlocked desert nation used to have a sea of its own. It was called the Aral Sea, and it was no pond. It was once the 4th largest lake on the entire planet. A vast inland sea with its own fishing fleets, its own bustling port towns, its own horizon of open water. Boats hauled in tens of thousands of tons of fish a year. People built their whole lives around its shores. And then within a single human lifetime, it disappeared. The story is brutally simple. The Aral Sea was fed by 2 great rivers. Decades ago, Soviet planners decided to divert those rivers, to pull the water out into the desert to grow cotton, the crop they proudly called white gold. It worked in the short term. The cotton grew, but the rivers stopped reaching the sea, and a body of water the size of a small country began, year after year, to evaporate into nothing. Today, where there were once waves, there is sand. And sitting in that sand, tilted over and rusting in the open desert, are ships. Entire fishing boats, marooned dozens of miles from the nearest water, stranded where the sea abandoned them. It is one of the worst environmental disasters in human history. A country that, impossibly, managed to drink its own sea dry, and losing the sea did more than strand the boats. That huge body of water used to act like a thermostat, softening the region's weather. Once it was gone, the summers turned hotter and the winters colder and harsher. Worse, the wind began lifting the salt and farm chemicals off the dried-out seabed and flinging them across the land in toxic dust storms. A vanished sea reached out and changed the climate, the soil, and the health of the people who had lived on its shore. The water left and took the weather with it. So now you've got a doubly landlocked country that you can't sail out of, that nonetheless found a way to lose a sea. And the rivers that did it? They tell the same strange story. The Amu Darya and the Sir Darya are powerful rivers, fed by snowmelt from some of the highest mountains in the world. But follow either of them to the end, and you'll find something unsettling. They don't go anywhere. They never reach an ocean. They flow inland, spread out, and simply die in the desert and the dust. Like the country they run through, like the boats stranded in the sand, the water has nowhere to escape to. In Uzbekistan, everything flows inward, and everything stays. By now, Uzbekistan sounds like the most isolated, sealed off, forgotten corner of the world you could possibly imagine. So here's the fact that breaks the whole picture apart. This place, This sea-locked interior, this dead end of rivers, was once the beating center of the entire world. Their names still sound like legend: Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva. These were not backwaters. They were among the greatest cities on Earth, the glittering crossroads of the Silk Road, the network of trade routes that carried silk, spices, gold, and ideas between China and Europe for well over 1,000 years. Caravans from half the planet converged here. The wealth of empires passed through these markets. Religions, languages, mathematics, and art flowed across this ground in every direction at once. Think about that. The most landlocked country in the entire World Cup, a place you'd struggle to reach the ocean from in less than 2 days of travel, was, in its golden age, not the edge of anywhere. It was the middle of everywhere. The single most connected place in the ancient world sits inside the single most sea-isolated country in the modern tournament. That is the contradiction at the heart of this whole country. Uzbekistan is a desert that lost a sea, a dead end for rivers that never reached the ocean, a crossroads of the world that you now have to cross 2 borders to escape. And reaching that pitch was its own long ordeal. Uzbek football has carried decades of heartbreak. A generation of its brightest players lost in a mid-air collision in 1979, and qualifying campaign after qualifying campaign that ended in agonizing near misses. 7 times they tried for a World Cup and fell short. The 8th time at last they made it. So when the team they call the White Wolves finally walks out in 2026, 35 years after independence sealed them away from the coast, they will have crossed an entire ocean to play a tournament on the water's edge. A country with no sea, that once had a sea, whose rivers find no sea, that once ruled the trade of a world it now sits buried in the middle of. Uzbekistan does not make sense, and that is exactly what makes it one of the most extraordinary places on the map.